What would you do if the government showed up at your door tomorrow and told you they were taking your family's land? What if they offered you pocket change for property worth millions? And what if you discovered a 90-year-old family secret that could turn their power grab into the biggest payday of your life? Most people would take the money and walk away. Most people don't know their rights. Most people don't have a grandfather who was smart enough to hide a nuclear weapon in plain sight for nearly a century. I'm not most people. This is the true story of how I made the United States government pay me $2 billion for trying to steal what was never theirs to take. It's about family secrets, legal loopholes, and what happens when a small-town rancher decides to fight back against the most powerful forces in America. By the end of this story, you'll never look at government offers the same way again. My name is Lydia McGraw, and I'm about to tell you how the government tried to steal my family's land, and how I made them pay $2 billion for the mistake. The McGraw Ranch has been ours since 1903. 120 years of sweat, tears, and stubborn pride soaked into every acre. My great-grandfather Everett bought this land back when oil was more nuisance than treasure in these parts. For generations of my family built their lives here. Raised cattle, grew corn, buried their dead in the family plot overlooking the creek. This dirt didn't just belong to us, we belonged to it. But land is expensive to love, especially when it's all you have. Twice, we almost lost everything. The first time was when medical bills from my father's cancer threatened to drown us. The second was during the drought of 2015, when every crop failed and the bank came knocking. Both times, I refused to sell. Something my grandfather once told me kept echoing, never sell what they're afraid to dig under. I thought he was talking about our family cemetery. I was wrong. What he knew would change everything. Standing on the front porch this morning, coffee steam rising in the cold air, I can see 4 generations of McGraw history stretching across these 160 acres. The original homestead barn, weathered gray but still standing. The newer cattle pen my father built in '89. The equipment shed I put up myself 5 years ago. Every structure tells a story of survival. Of people who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. My great-grandfather Everett was a railroad man who saved every penny to buy this land. My grandfather expanded the ranch, adding the western pastures during the Depression when desperate neighbors sold cheap. My father, Eli, modernized our operations in the '90s, installing pivot irrigation in '92 and bringing in new Angus breeding stock. Each generation left something behind. Each made the land a little more valuable, a little harder to lose. But they also left debts. Mortgages. Medical bills. Property taxes that climbed higher every year while commodity prices stayed flat. The land was rich, in history, in potential, in everything except ready cash. That's what made the government's offer so insulting. And their greed so obvious. They knew something we didn't. Yet. I should have seen the signs earlier. The survey crews that appeared last summer, marking trees with orange spray paint. The official-looking vehicles driving slow past our gate, passengers pointing and taking notes. When I asked county planning about it, they gave me the runaround. Routine infrastructure assessment, they said. Nothing to worry about. But I learned long ago that when government officials tell you not to worry, that's exactly when you should start losing sleep. The first real warning came from old Pete Garrison, whose spread bordered ours to the east. Pete had been getting visits from men in expensive suits who said they were consultants working on behalf of infrastructure development, asking questions about mineral rights and offering to review his property deeds. They're sniffing around for something, Lydia, Pete told me over coffee at Morrison's Diner. These ain't no regular land speculators. These boys got federal money behind them. Pete had lived through every boom and bust cycle this county had seen. Oil discoveries in the '70s, natural gas fracking in the 2000s, and now something new brewing. What kind of questions? I asked. The kind that suggest they already know the answers. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something was coming for our land. I just didn't know how big it would be. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago. I was mending fence when my phone rang, Dad's doctor's office, asking us to come in immediately. Stage 4 colon cancer. Metastasized to his liver and lungs. 6 months, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. Dad sat in that sterile office chair, his work-worn hands folded in his lap, and asked the question that would haunt us: how much will treatment cost? Dr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. With your insurance situation. We had no insurance. Small ranchers like us couldn't afford the premiums. We'd always been healthy, always gotten by on luck and stubbornness. Now luck had run out. The treatment protocol we're recommending costs well over $250,000, Henderson said quietly. That's before complications. I watched my father's face go gray. Not from the cancer, from the math. Our land was worth maybe $400,000 on a good day. Treatment would eat half of that. We could sell some acreage, Dad whispered as we drove home. No, I said. We'll figure something else out. But late that night, I sat at the kitchen table with our financial records spread before me, running numbers that wouldn't add up. The cancer was going to kill more than just my father. The bills started arriving before the first chemotherapy session even ended. Hospital admission fees. Lab work. Specialist consultations. Each envelope contained another $1,000 gut punch. Dad grew weaker, but the bills grew stronger. They multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through our kitchen table filing system until I couldn't see the wood underneath. Lydia, sweetheart, Dad said one evening, his voice paper-thin from the treatments. Maybe we should consider selling the 40 acres down by Miller's Creek. Just temporarily. We could buy it back when what? I snapped, then immediately felt guilty. When you're better, the bills will still be there. We sell any land, we'll never get it back. But I was lying. I'd already called 3 real estate agents for informal appraisals. The 40 acres Dad wanted to sell were our best pasture land, worth maybe $50,000. Enough to buy us 2 months of treatment. 2 months. For land that had been ours for over a century. That night, I walked those 40 acres in the moonlight, trying to imagine them belonging to strangers. Trying to figure out which mattered more, preserving the past or saving my father's future. By morning, I knew what Dad would tell me to do. But I couldn't do it. Dad lasted 14 months, not 6. 14 months of fighting both cancer and medical bankruptcy with equal determination. We sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Cattle, equipment, even my mother's wedding ring. I took a job at the grain elevator, working nights to keep the ranch running during the day. But Dad never gave up on treatment, and I never gave up on keeping our land whole. I barely slept those months, just ran on black coffee, grief, and muscle memory. The oncologist said it was remarkable how Dad responded to therapy. His will to live is extraordinary, Dr. Henderson told me during one visit. What Henderson didn't understand was that Dad wasn't just fighting to live, he was fighting to die on land that still belonged to his family. The cancer took him on a Tuesday in December, with snow covering the pastures and ice forming on the stock tanks. His last words were about spring planting schedules and whether I'd remembered to supplement the cattle's mineral feed. He died broke but not landless. It was exactly what he would have wanted. At his funeral, I stood by his grave in our family cemetery and made a promise. The land would stay whole. Whatever it took. 3 months later, the drought began, and I learned that promises are easier to make than keep. The drought of 2015 started quietly. April passed without the usual spring rains. May brought scattered showers that barely settled the dust. By June, we knew we were in trouble. By August, we were in hell. The corn withered brown and brittle. Pastures turned to dirt lots. The creek that had run for over a century went dry for the first time in recorded memory. Cattle prices collapsed as everyone tried to sell before their herd starved. Feed costs skyrocketed. Every day became a math problem. How much does it cost to keep a cow alive versus what you can sell her for? I sold 60% of our herd at a massive loss. The remaining cattle huddled around the few water tanks I could still fill, looking at me with accusing eyes every time I walked past. Property taxes came due in September. $8,500. The county had reassessed our land at commercial development rates after rumors of infrastructure projects started circulating. I had $800 in checking and no prospects for more. The county assessor, Jimmy Morrison, was surprisingly sympathetic when I called. "Lydia, honey, you've got maybe 60 days before we start foreclosure proceedings. Can you raise anything?" Anything. Like our land was just anything. That night, I stared at the unsigned contract from the Denver investment firm. $620,000 for 160 acres. Enough to pay taxes, cover debts, and start fresh somewhere else. But where would I go? This land was all I knew. Word travels fast in ranch country when someone's desperate, especially after you call the county assessor about overdue taxes. By October, I was getting calls from investors I'd never heard of, offering cash for quick sales. A smooth-talking man from Oklahoma City offered $480,000 for the whole ranch, as is, no inspection needed. A real estate syndicate from Phoenix wanted to subdivide the property for rural residential development. Each offer was worse than the last. These weren't buyers, they were carrion feeders, waiting for financial death to set in. The worst was Bradley Foster from Denver Investment Partners. He showed up unannounced in a black Mercedes, wearing a suit that cost more than I made in 3 months. "Miss McGraw, I'm prepared to offer $620,000 cash for your property. That's above market value, given current conditions." He spread papers across my kitchen table like he owned the place already. Purchase agreement. Cash wire instructions. All requiring just my signature. "Take the weekend to think about it," Foster said, standing to leave. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait forever." After he left, I sat at that table for hours, holding a pen over his signature line. Outside, the wind blew dust across fields that used to grow corn. The silence was complete, no cattle, no machinery, no life. Just me and a decision that would end everything my family had built. That weekend, I cleaned out Dad's office for the first time since his death. Going through his papers, trying to find something, anything, that might give me another option. I found his last journal, hidden under a stack of cattle breeding records. The final entry was dated 3 days before he died. "Lydia's going to face choices I couldn't prepare her for. Hope she remembers what Daddy always said about never selling what they're afraid to dig under. She'll understand someday." Grandfather Everett. Always full of cryptic advice that made no sense until years later. I'd heard that phrase my whole life and repeated it without ever asking myself what it really meant. Never sell what they're afraid to dig under. I thought it meant our family cemetery. 5 generations of McGraws buried on the hill overlooking the creek. But suddenly, in Dad's empty office, it occurred to me that I'd never actually explored what Grandpa meant. He died when I was 12, taking his secrets with him. Or so I thought. Dad's journal included something I'd never seen before. Lydia should check the attic lockbox behind the loose board, 3rd rafter from the east wall. Daddy's papers are still there. Grandpa Everett had been dead for 25 years. What papers could possibly still matter? Monday morning, the Denver investment firm was expecting my answer. I had less than 48 hours to decide my family's fate. But first, I had an attic to explore. The attic ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up with a flashlight and crowbar Sunday morning. 3rd rafter from the east wall, just like Dad's journal said. The loose board came away easily, revealing a hiding place that had been undisturbed for decades. Behind it sat a small fireproof lockbox, covered in dust but still solid. Inside were documents I'd never seen. Property deeds, survey maps, correspondence with lawyers and government officials. All dating from the 1930s, all bearing Grandfather Everett's careful signature. But one document made my hands shake, a severed mineral rights deed dated 1932. According to the legal language, Grandfather Everett had executed 2 deeds during the Depression. One selling surface rights to the county, one buying them back with mineral rights explicitly excluded from the surface title. The deed was filed, notarized, and recorded in the county courthouse. But we still owned the land surface. How was that possible? I kept reading. Apparently, the county had immediately sold the surface rights back to Grandpa for $1, essentially giving him a legal separation between surface and mineral ownership. Why would he do that? What did he know? At the bottom of the box was a letter from a geology company, dated 1933. Mr. McGraw, our preliminary survey confirms significant oil deposits beneath your property. Recommend maintaining mineral rights at all costs. Grandpa had known about oil 80 years ago. And he'd made sure future generations would control it. The question was, did anyone else know? Monday morning brought a certified letter that changed everything. Thick envelope, government seal, return address from the State Infrastructure Development Authority. Notice of eminent domain proceedings, emergency infrastructure corridor designation. My hands trembled as I read the legal language. Our land was being seized for a green infrastructure corridor, apparently some kind of lithium battery transmission line combined with an oil pipeline reroute. The compensation offer made me laugh bitterly. $181,000 for 160 acres now appraised by the county at over $5 million. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the internal geological assessment mistakenly included with the packet. It detailed underground formations, mineral deposits, and geological structures with precision that suggested months of secret analysis. They knew. The government knew exactly what lay beneath our land, and they were trying to steal it for pennies on the dollar. I called the county office immediately. This is Lydia McGraw. I need to speak to someone about this eminent domain notice. I'm sorry, Miss McGraw, but the decision is final. State-level authority. You can file an appeal, but what about mineral rights? I interrupted. A long pause. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean the mineral rights to my property. What happens to those under eminent domain? Another pause. You'd need to speak to an attorney about that. They didn't know. The government had assumed mineral rights transferred with surface ownership. They had no idea what Grandfather Everett had done in 1932. I was holding a nuclear weapon, and they'd just declared war. I spent the next 3 days studying every document in Grandfather Everett's lockbox, cross-referencing with modern property records and state law. The picture that emerged was breathtaking. In 1932, Grandfather Everett had legally separated mineral rights from surface ownership through a complex transaction that looked like a simple sale and buyback. But the mineral rights deed was never transferred. It remained active under his name and passed to his heirs, meaning me. The annual tax records showed he'd been paying mineral rights taxes separately from property taxes. $14.17 every year, faithfully paid through a private escrow account that was still active. The government's eminent domain seizure would give them surface rights only. They could build their pipeline, install their infrastructure, even prevent me from farming the land. But they couldn't drill. They couldn't extract oil. They couldn't access the minerals worth billions of dollars beneath the surface. Not without my permission. The eminent domain notice included geological surveys estimating 47 million barrels of recoverable crude oil beneath our property. At current prices, oil's current market put this at over $3.2 billion, but that number could swing with just a global headline. Still, billions of dollars worth of oil sitting underneath land they were stealing for $181,000. I picked up the phone to call Bradley Foster from Denver Investment Partners. Mr. Foster? This is Lydia McGraw. About that cash offer for my ranch? I'm afraid there's been a change in circumstances. Oh. Having second thoughts about selling? No, sir. I'm having second thoughts about the price. The game had just changed completely. I needed an attorney. Not the family lawyer who'd handled Dad's will, but someone who specialized in mineral rights and could go head-to-head with state and federal agencies. The phone book gave me 3 options in Oklahoma. I called the first one. A firm in the capital that advertised resource law and government relations. We'll need a $25,000 retainer, the receptionist told me. Mineral rights cases against the state start at $150,000 in fees. I hung up and called the second firm. Same story, different numbers. The third listing was different, Jackson and Associates, Lawton. Small-town lawyers for big-time problems. Robert Jackson answered his own phone. Mineral rights, you said? Against eminent domain? Well now, that's interesting. I drove to Lawton that afternoon with grandfather Everett's documents. Jackson's office was above a hardware store, nothing fancy, but his law degree from University of Oklahoma was prominently displayed. Miss McGraw, Jackson said after reviewing the papers, your grandfather was a very clever man. This deed separation is airtight. Has anyone else seen these documents? Just you. Good. Don't show them to anyone else yet. Let me verify the current legal status and run some research. If I'm reading this correctly, you've got the state of Oklahoma over a barrel. Literally. He quoted me a contingency fee, 2% of any settlement or a $50,000 flat cap, whichever is less. Nothing if we lose. Mr. Jackson, I don't have $50,000. He smiled. You will soon, Miss McGraw. You will very soon. News travels fast in small towns, especially when someone's fighting the government. By Thursday, I had 3 messages from companies wanting to buy my mineral rights. The first call came from Tulsa. Miss McGraw, this is Jennifer Martinez from Prairie Energy Partners. We understand you may be facing some legal challenges. We'd like to offer you $2.3 million for your mineral rights, cash, immediate settlement. $2.3 million. More money than I'd ever imagined owning. Let me think about it, I said. Of course. But ISS McGraw? These legal battles can drag on for years. Costs can be enormous. A sure thing today might be worth more than a gamble tomorrow. After I hung up, I called Robert Jackson. They're offering $2.3 million. Should I take it? Jackson laughed. Miss McGraw, did you read those geological surveys in the government's eminent domain filing? 47 million barrels of recoverable oil. At current prices, that's about $3 billion worth of crude. They're offering you less than 1% of the value. I'd say that's a lowball offer. That evening, a black SUV with Canadian plates drove slowly past my house 3 times. The third time, it stopped, and a man in an expensive suit knocked on my door. Miss McGraw? I'm Thomas Morrison from Alberta Energy Corporation. I believe we have something very important to discuss. This wasn't a phone call anymore. They were coming to my door. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Thomas Morrison from Alberta Energy was different from the phone callers. Polite, well-informed, and carrying a briefcase that suggested serious money. Miss McGraw, we're prepared to offer $9.8 million for your mineral rights. Full payment within 30 days, all legal costs covered. He spread photographs across my kitchen table, satellite images of our property with geological overlays showing the oil formations beneath. Technical analysis I'd never seen before. How did you get these surveys? I asked. We've been monitoring this region for several years. Your property sits on one of the largest untapped reserves in the continental United States. Nearly $10 million. Life-changing money. Money that would let me keep the surface land and never worry about property taxes again. What's the catch? I asked. Morrison smiled. No catch. Just good business. We drill, we extract, we restore the land when we're finished. You get paid, we get oil, everyone wins. After he left, I sat at that kitchen table until midnight, staring at the contract. The offer was real, verified funds, legitimate company, legal guarantees. But something bothered me. If the oil was worth billions, why were they offering millions? I called Robert Jackson at home. They're offering nearly 10 million now. What am I missing? You're missing the fact that they're scared, Miss McGraw. Companies don't escalate offers this fast unless they're desperate. Someone's putting pressure on them to lock you up before you understand what you really have. What do I really have? Control, Miss McGraw. Absolute control over something they desperately need. Friday morning brought another certified letter, this one from the State Attorney General's office. McGraw Property Mineral Rights Dispute, Mandatory Mediation Notice. The state wanted to meet. They weren't asking anymore. The letter was signed by someone named Director Patricia Coleman from the Infrastructure Development Authority, demanding my presence at a resolution conference in the state capitol next Tuesday. Failure to appear may result in additional legal proceedings, the letter warned. I called Robert Jackson immediately. They're demanding a meeting. Good, Jackson said. That means they've figured out you own the mineral rights and they're panicking. Don't go alone. I'll be with you. What do they want? Same thing everyone else wants, your signature on a document transferring your rights for a fraction of their value. But now they're using government intimidation instead of private offers. That afternoon, another visitor arrived. This time it was someone claiming to represent the original eminent domain action. Miss McGraw, I'm here to clarify some misunderstandings about your property situation, said the woman who introduced herself as legal coordinator Jennifer Walsh. There seems to be some confusion about mineral rights ownership. Wait. The instructions specifically said to avoid the name Walsh. Let me change this. Miss McGraw, I'm here to clarify some misunderstandings about your property situation, said the woman who introduced herself as legal coordinator Jennifer Adams. There seems to be some confusion about mineral rights ownership. No confusion, I said. I own them. Actually, under state infrastructure emergency powers, mineral rights can be included in eminent domain proceedings when they're essential to public projects. It was a bluff. They were trying to scare me into surrendering rights they couldn't legally take. I'll see you in court, I said, closing the door. The war was escalating. Tuesday morning, Robert Jackson and I drove to the state capitol for the mandatory mediation meeting. The government building was imposing, all marble and authority, designed to make citizens feel small. Director Patricia Coleman was waiting with 4 other officials whose titles I didn't catch. They sat across from us at a polished conference table that probably cost more than my annual income. Miss McGraw, Coleman began, we're hoping to resolve this situation amicably. The state's infrastructure project is essential for economic development and environmental protection. What are you proposing? Jackson asked. We're prepared to increase the compensation for Miss McGraw's property to $400,000, and will include mineral rights in the eminent domain settlement. Jackson smiled. Director Coleman, you can't include something in eminent domain that you don't have the authority to take. Mineral rights in Oklahoma require separate legal proceedings. Coleman's expression tightened. Mr. Jackson, I think you'll find that state emergency powers are quite broad. Not that broad, Jackson replied. Miss McGraw's mineral rights are protected under state constitution. You'll need to prove abandonment or negotiate a private sale. And what would Miss McGraw consider acceptable for a private sale? Coleman asked. I looked at Jackson. We discussed this moment. My answer would set the tone for everything that followed. I'm not interested in selling, I said quietly. Everyone has a price, Miss McGraw. Then you haven't found mine yet. The meeting ended badly. As we left, Coleman called after us, Miss McGraw, fighting the state is expensive. Make sure you can afford the costs. It sounded like a threat. The pressure began immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, I received notices from different agencies about irregularities, requiring investigation. First the IRS letter arrived, wanting to audit my tax returns. Then the EPA claimed someone had reported potential environmental violations on my property. Finally, the Department of Agriculture questioned my cattle operation permits, like falling dominoes. None of it was coincidence. They're trying to bury you in bureaucratic costs, Jackson explained. Force you to spend money on compliance and legal fees until you're willing to sell just to make it stop. But they'd made a mistake. Each agency contact included technical details about my property that proved they'd been coordinating surveillance for months. The EPA letter referenced geological surveys that were supposedly confidential. The Agriculture Department cited herd counts that required aerial observation. Save every document, Jackson advised. This pressure campaign proves they knew about the oil deposits before they filed eminent domain. That's evidence of bad faith proceedings. Meanwhile, the private offers kept climbing. Prairie Energy Partners called with a new offer, $15 million. Alberta Energy sent another representative with authority to go up to $22 million. But the most interesting contact came from an unexpected source. Miss McGraw? This is Patricia Coleman from the Infrastructure Development Authority. Off the record, I'd like to discuss a private arrangement. The same government official who'd tried to intimidate me was now calling personally, after hours, suggesting we meet somewhere other than her office. Whatever I had, it was bigger than I'd realized. And apparently worth more than anyone was telling me. Patricia Coleman suggested we meet at a coffee shop 20 miles from the Capitol, away from her office and anyone who might recognize us. She arrived first, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall like she was afraid of being seen. When I walked in with Robert Jackson, her face tightened. I thought this would be a private conversation, Miss McGraw. In my experience, conversations with government officials should always have witnesses, I replied. Coleman looked tired, like someone carrying problems she couldn't solve. Miss McGraw, what I'm about to tell you is confidential. The infrastructure project your land affects isn't just state level. It's federal. Department of Energy. National security implications. Jackson leaned forward. What kind of national security? The oil formation beneath Miss McGraw's property is part of a strategic reserve network. Domestic production essential for reducing foreign dependency. This isn't about money anymore, it's about American energy independence. That's very patriotic, I said. But it's still my oil. Coleman pulled out a folder. The federal government is actively considering different authorities than the state. There are ongoing classified discussions at the DOE level about strategic resource designations. Under what legal framework? Jackson challenged. Defense Production Act. Strategic resource designation. There are precedents, and federal agencies are exploring their options. Jackson laughed. Director Coleman, those precedents involve wartime emergency declarations. Are you planning to declare war on Miss McGraw? Coleman stood to leave. I'm trying to help her avoid a legal battle she can't win. The federal government has resources that individual citizens don't. After she left, I asked Jackson, can they really do that? Take the mineral rights under federal authority? They can try, Jackson said. But it would require proving national security emergency, and that requires congressional authorization. They're bluffing. What if they're not? Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Then we'd better move fast. We're not waiting for them to escalate this further, Jackson announced the next morning. We're going on offense. His plan was aggressive, file a federal lawsuit claiming the government had violated my constitutional rights through the eminent domain proceeding. The lawsuit would force them to reveal what they knew about the oil deposits and when they knew it. If we can prove they targeted your land because of the oil, not for legitimate infrastructure needs, the entire eminent domain action becomes invalid, Jackson explained. We filed on Friday. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing constantly. The first call came from Alberta Energy Corporation, Miss McGraw. We're now authorized to offer $35 million for immediate settlement. The second was from a law firm I'd never heard of. Miss McGraw, we represent certain parties who believe you're making a serious mistake. We'd like to discuss alternative arrangements. The third was from Patricia Coleman, Miss McGraw, you've just made this situation much more complicated than it needed to be. But the fourth call was the most interesting. It came from a journalist. Miss McGraw, this is Michael Torres from the Oklahoma City Tribune. I've been investigating unusual eminent domain cases, and yours just appeared in federal court. Would you be willing to comment on why the government seems so interested in your ranch? I thought about Grandfather Everett's advice, never sell what they're afraid to dig under. Maybe it was time to let people know what they were afraid of. Mr. Torres, I said, I think you should come out here and see for yourself. Publicity was about to change everything. Michael Torres arrived Tuesday afternoon with a photographer and enough questions to fill a notebook. He was young, ambitious, and clearly smelled a story bigger than routine eminent domain disputes. Miss McGraw, according to court filings, your property sits on oil reserves worth potentially billions of dollars. Did you know about this before the government seizure notice? I showed him Grandfather Everett's documents. The 1932 mineral rights deed. The geological survey from 1933. The evidence that my family had known about oil for 90 years. Your grandfather separated mineral rights from surface ownership during the Depression? That's remarkably prescient. Grandfather Everett was a smart man. He told me never to sell what they're afraid to dig under. Torres spent 3 hours interviewing me, taking photos of the documents, and walking the property with his photographer. When they left, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Wednesday morning, I had my answer. The Tribune's front page headline read, Government tries to steal billion-dollar oil rights from Oklahoma rancher. By noon, my phone hadn't stopped ringing. CNN, Fox News, CBS, newspapers from across the country. Everyone wanted to interview the woman fighting the government over oil rights. More importantly, the private offers suddenly escalated dramatically. Miss McGraw, this is Jonathan Crawford from Continental Resources. We're prepared to offer $50 million for your mineral rights. $50 million. And I suspected it was still just the opening bid. Patricia Coleman called that afternoon, her voice tight with anger. Miss McGraw, you've made this a public circus. That helps no one. It helps me, I replied. Funny how publicity makes government officials suddenly polite. Don't mistake publicity for protection, Miss McGraw. After I hung up, I realized she was right. I just declared war on powerful people with unlimited resources. I hoped I was ready for what came next. The media attention brought unexpected allies. Environmental groups opposed to pipeline expansion rallied to my cause. Property rights organizations cited my case as government overreach. Politicians from both parties started making statements about protecting small farmers from bureaucratic abuse. But it also brought serious pressure. Friday morning, Robert Jackson called with urgent news. Lydia, they've filed a motion for expedited proceedings. They want to force a quick resolution before public opinion gets any stronger. What does that mean? It means we're going to court next week. Federal judge, full hearing, winner takes all. That afternoon, I received the most serious offer yet. A consortium of energy companies, working together, $75 million upfront with production start timeline within 6 months, all legal costs covered. $75 million. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Why so much? I asked their representative. Miss McGraw, your case has created uncertainty in energy markets. Companies need to know who controls those mineral rights. We're paying for certainty as much as oil. That evening, I walked the land that had caused so much trouble. Grandfather Everett's voice seemed to whisper through the wind, never sell what they're afraid to dig under. But was I fighting for principle or just being stubborn? $75 million would solve every problem I'd ever have. Robert Jackson arrived that night with final preparations for court. Lydia, tomorrow changes everything. Win or lose, your life will never be the same. What do you think our chances are? Honestly? 50-50. But the stakes are so high that 50-50 might be enough. I didn't sleep that night. Tomorrow would determine whether grandfather Everett's 90-year gamble would finally pay off. Federal court was intimidating. The government brought 8 attorneys, each carrying briefcases that suggested months of preparation. Energy company representatives filled the gallery, along with journalists and curious observers drawn by media coverage. Judge Patricia Delaney was known for sharp questions and quick decisions. She reviewed our evidence methodically: grandfather Everett's mineral rights deed, tax payment records, geological surveys, and the government's own documentation of oil reserves. Mr. Jackson, Judge Delaney asked, your client claims absolute ownership of mineral rights beneath property now controlled by the state through eminent domain. Explain how surface and mineral rights can be completely separated. Jackson presented our case clearly. The 1932 deed separation was legal and properly recorded. Annual tax payments proved continuous ownership. The government's eminent domain action explicitly excluded mineral rights because they knew those rights belonged to someone else. The government's lead attorney argued that strategic national resources couldn't be held hostage by individual property owners. That emergency infrastructure needs superseded Depression-era legal technicalities. Judge Delaney asked the question that mattered. Does the state have any evidence that Miss McGraw's mineral rights were abandoned, transferred, or otherwise invalidated? No, Your Honor. But we contend that national security interests justify federal acquisition under existing emergency powers. Mr. Jackson, how do you respond? Your Honor, the Constitution protects private property rights precisely because future generations might claim emergency justification for seizure. Grandfather Everett's foresight in 1932 shouldn't be invalidated by government convenience in 2025. Judge Delaney announced she would rule within 48 hours. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the weight of 4 generations of McGraw determination on my shoulders. Judge Delaney called all parties back to court Friday afternoon. The courtroom was packed: media, energy company representatives, government officials, and curious citizens who'd followed the case. This case presents fundamental questions about property rights, government authority, and individual liberty, Judge Delaney began. After careful consideration of evidence and legal precedent, I rule as follows. My heart stopped. The mineral rights deed executed by Everett McGraw in 1932 is valid and binding. The separation of surface and mineral rights was properly recorded and maintained through consistent tax payments. The government's eminent domain action cannot include mineral rights that were never abandoned or transferred. We won. I owned 47 million barrels of oil beneath land the government had stolen. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. However, this ruling creates practical complications. The state cannot complete its infrastructure project without access to underground resources. Miss McGraw cannot extract oil without surface access now controlled by the government. Though negotiated lease agreements or directional drilling from adjacent land could provide alternatives. She looked directly at me. Miss McGraw, you have absolute legal right to your mineral resources. But practical extraction requires cooperation with current surface rights holders. I strongly recommend negotiated settlement. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me. Miss McGraw, what's your next move? I thought about grandfather Everett, about 4 generations of McGraw stubbornness, about never selling what they're afraid to dig under. I'm going home, I said. And then I'm going to make some phone calls. Within an hour, my phone was ringing. Energy companies, government mediators, investment bankers. Everyone wanted to negotiate. The final offer came from an unexpected source, a joint government-private energy consortium. They didn't want to buy my mineral rights. They wanted to lease them. For $2 billion. 2 months later, I sat in a boardroom in Oklahoma City, facing 4 oil company executives and 1 very polite government mediator. With global tensions rising and oil prices spiking, urgency drove negotiations higher than anyone expected. The contract before me was 47 pages of legal language that boiled down to something simple: $2 billion for a 30-year lease with 3% royalty on all extracted oil. I didn't ask for $2 billion. They offered it. They had no choice. The lease gave them extraction rights while preserving my ownership. The government got their infrastructure corridor. The energy companies got their oil. I got enough money to restore my family's legacy and secure our land forever. But the most important clause was one I insisted on: all land reclamation must restore the property to original agricultural use, with the McGraw family name permanently displayed on any historical markers. I signed the contract with a pen grandfather Everett had used to sign the original mineral rights deed in 1932. Today, I've rebuilt our family home bigger and better than before. I've paid off the debts of every cousin still living in this county and funded a new cancer center in my father's name. Most importantly, I kept 40 acres untouched, wild and free, just like grandfather Everett wanted. The oil derricks pump steadily in the distance, extracting wealth that's been sleeping under our land for millions of years. But every evening, I walk those 40 untouched acres and remember what my grandfather taught me: never sell what they're afraid to dig under. They tried to take everything. But all they really did was wake the land up, and remind a stubborn McGraw woman that some things are worth fighting for. For generations of my family built this legacy. Now it's secure for the next 4 generations. Sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to quit. That's my story. If you enjoyed this wild ride of David versus Goliath, show some love by hitting that like button. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think I played it right, or would you have taken that first $75 million offer? And if you're hungry for more crazy revenge stories where the little guy wins against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Some of these stories will blow your mind. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. See you in the next one.